Hello, this is the Biblical Literacy Project with Dr. Amy Anderson. And today we're going to be starting a series of 3 videos on the prison epistles. And you'll notice that I have said overview of the 3 letters, and you might be saying, but aren't there 4 prison epistles? And actually, there are 5 epistles or letters that Paul wrote from prison. The Philippians is the 4th one that's usually collected with these 3. And 2 Timothy was written from prison at the very end of Paul's life. We'll actually be looking at 2 Timothy later for a piece of information. But we are talking specifically about the 3 of the 4 or 5 prison letters that are connected to each other. The letters to Colossae, to Philemon, and what is called the letter to the Ephesians, and you'll have to listen to the 3rd video to know why I say it that way. They are thought to have all been written from the same Roman imprisonment in about AD 61. And we'll see that these letters are connected by a number of things. First of all, by Epaphras and Tychicus, who will be named several times. There will be a few other details that will also be part of that connecting. Ephesians and Colossians are also called the twin letters because they have very much of their wording in common, or their themes. And therefore, for this and several other reasons, an overview of all 3 of them will be the best way to start studying any of them. So if you were studying Philemon or Ephesians, you would also want to start with this piece of information that I've just given you, and keep referring back to the other 2 letters as you go. But we will now focus in, first of all, on Colossians. Actually, I will first of all give you a little bit of geography. Where are these cities? Well, there's only 2 cities in the names of letters. One is Ephesus for Ephesians, and the other is Colossae. But we're also going to be naming Laodicea. And notice that Laodicea and Colossae are very close together, and Ephesus a little bit further. But all of them are in Asia Minor. And in fact, Colossae is one of the most important cities in the region of Phrygia, which is named right there. Let's see, I think we'll move on to another slide here. Yes, Colossae is named Konas today. So if you wanted to visit near where the ancient city is, which has not yet been excavated, you would want to go to a modern city of Konas. Colossae was an important city of Phrygia, as I said already, and on the Lycus River, which we can get a look at right here. That's what it looks like today. That is probably quite different than what it looked like 2,000 years ago. You'll see, for example, that it has worn down through the bank here, and there was this entire width at one point. Whether it filled that entire width or whether it washed away different parts as time went on, I don't know. That would be an interesting thing to find out about. And you'll notice that it also says here that Colossae was located on the Silk Road, which connected the Euphrates Valley to Ephesus. And let's just look at what that would mean. The Euphrates Valley would be over here off the map at this point, and the Silk Road would have come through here and gone through Colossae on the way to Ephesus, which is then a seaport, and things could be shipped from there. So Colossae is an important city, and there are a number of pretty nice pictures that I was able to discover online. This is a picture of the tell. Tell is the word that means this is an ancient ruins that is now covered up with land. But you can tell that there is an ancient ruins there by the shape of the land. I have a second picture of the tell taken at a different time, which is prettier, and you can see the grapevines growing here down below, covered with green grass. And just for fun, I also have a picture of one of my former students standing on the tell. There's Mitch. All right. So let's move on now to the Google Earth view of the tell. The highest point in the city would have been the Acropolis, with the city surrounding it then on the lower plain. And this may be actually what we see as the tell in the photos, although this is also elevated. I wish I could go there and see it. And notice also here, carved into the eastern slope, is the theater. And I have another picture of the theater from directly next to it, where you can see the seating that has survived all these years and can still be seen. So that's just a few little things to give you a feel for the city of Colossae and as it looks today. We're going to now be looking at scripture to learn some things. And what you should do is stop the video, look these verses up yourself so that you can follow along with me, then start it up again. But I will read them to you. In chapter 2, verse 1 of Colossians, we learn something. Paul says, "For I want you to know how great a struggle I have on your behalf, and for all those who are at Laodicea, and for all those who have not personally seen my face." I think what he's implying there is that he did not found the church in Colossae. It's not one of his churches that he started, nor did he found the one in Laodicea, which we will continue to refer to. Then we learn a few other things historically and about people. These are the sort of things you should watch for when you read the letters. People tend to read the letters of Paul devotionally, and there's nothing wrong with doing that. But you can learn so many things historically if you pay attention to things, to hints in the letters. Like this, in 1:7-8, Paul says, "Just as you learned it," so he's talking about the grace of God, "just as you learned it from Epaphras, our beloved fellow bondservant, who is a faithful servant of Christ on our behalf. And he also informed us of your love in the Spirit." Paul's having an interaction with a man named Epaphras. So we're finding out a little bit about him here, that Paul and he are interacting. And then in chapter 4, verse 12, Paul also says, "Epaphras, who is one of your number, a bondslave of Jesus Christ, sends you his greetings, always laboring earnestly for you in his prayers, that you may stand perfect and fully assured in all the will of God." So Epaphras may or may not have been the founder of this church, but he definitely is an important leader. And he is currently with Paul as he writes this letter to Colossae. It could be even that we're going to find out that there's a heresy going around in Colossae that they're concerned about. It could be that he has said, "Paul, could you share a word with my church and help them to understand what the authentic gospel is in comparison to the heretical teachings that they've been exposed to." And it's interesting because I'm going to connect the letter to Philemon very closely to this letter. In fact, I think it may be the reason Paul originally writes to a man named Philemon about his slave. And we'll have to wait for the second video teaching for that. But he's writing to Philemon, who almost certainly lives in Colossae and is a part of that church. And he tells Philemon in verse 23, "Epaphras, my fellow prisoner in Christ Jesus, greets you." Epaphras is in prison with Paul, not just visiting him, but both of them are in prison, and they've been discussing the church, and Paul is sitting down and writing a letter. And it could be he was going to write to Philemon because of his slave Onesimus, and Epaphras says, "Oh, please, while you're writing, could you send a letter to the whole church?" Now, we're guessing there, but it's not too far from the realm of possibility here that could really be what's happening. Another person is involved in this, and that is the man Tychicus. If I can get back to Colossians here. Chapter 4, verse 7 and 8. it says, Paul says to the Colossians, "As to all my affairs, Tychicus, our beloved brother and faithful servant and fellow bondservant in the Lord, will bring you information. For I have sent him to you for this very purpose, that you may know about our circumstances and that he may encourage your hearts." Now, if I do a more extended teaching on Colossians someday, I will do this in more detail. But I like to say that Tychicus is the most important first century Christian who you've never heard of. You've read his name when you read the scripture, but you don't pay much attention. But just let me show you some places where he shows up. When someone carries a letter in ancient times, they are like an ambassador. They are taking the letter in the place of the person who wrote it. So Tychicus goes to Colossae representing Paul. Paul says that he's going to teach them. In other words, what Tychicus says is what Paul would say. So he actually is carrying a pretty big load on his shoulders, not only the letter, but also the responsibility to bring Paul's message and Paul's opinion to this church. I think the reason we don't know about Tychicus is because Paul never had to write a letter to him. To Timothy and Titus and Philemon, he had to write letters, but not to Tychicus, maybe because he's a really good missionary and itinerant pastor in Paul's team. Paul really trusts him. And for some examples of that, let's look at Ephesians, which I'm later going to argue is sent at the same time as Colossians and Philemon. In chapter 6, verses 21 and 22, so almost at the end of the letter, Paul says to the Ephesians, whoever they are, "But that you also may know about my circumstances, how I am doing, Tychicus, the beloved brother and faithful minister in the Lord, will make everything known to you. And I have sent him to you for this very purpose, that you may know about us and that he may comfort your hearts." So look at that. Paul has great trust in this man and he is sending also the letter to the Ephesians with Tychicus. And then certainly at a different time, Paul writes to Titus. And in chapter 3, verse 12, he says, "When I send Artemas or Tychicus to you, make every effort to come to me at Nicopolis, for I have decided to spend the winter there." This is at towards the end of Paul's life. It's not as close to it as 2 Timothy is, which we'll read in a second. But Titus has been left behind in Crete to set some things in order in the churches there. And Paul is now calling him away and planning to leave either Artemas or Tychicus there instead. And similarly, in 2 Timothy, and this is at the end of Paul's life, chapter 4, verse 12 and 13, Paul says, "Only Luke is with me." That's verse 11. He says to Timothy, "Pick up Mark and bring him with you." Paul is in Rome awaiting trial. He says to Timothy, "Get Mark and bring him with you." So Timothy is being told to leave Ephesus, and he's really in Ephesus. And then Paul just reports, "I sent Tychicus to Ephesus." So is Tychicus carrying the letter, or has Paul already sent him before the letter was sent? That's not quite as clear here, but he may be also here, the letter carrier. And then he says, "Timothy, when you come, bring my cloak that I left at Troas and the books, especially the parchments," which I would love to get my hands on. All right. And then finally, we find out that there were, now I've got a crooked arrow and I don't know how to straighten it. We'll just let it be because I can't change it now. There were 2 or more letters carried at the same time. If we look at 4:16, Paul says to the Colossians, "When this letter is read among you, have it also read in the church of the Laodiceans." Remember how close the 2 cities were together. "And you, for your part, read my letter that is coming from Laodicea." So we know that Paul wrote a letter to Laodicea. Now, I will come back to this when we talk about Ephesians, because I think one of the solutions to this question may be that the letter to Laodicea is actually what we call Ephesians today. If it's not, then this letter has been lost. It's not extant. But notice what else Paul just did. He started them on the habit or custom of making copies of letters that went to other churches. This would be some of the very first copying of the books of the New Testament and collecting them in groups in various locations. So that's also historically significant to recognize that. Now, for every letter, almost every letter, I talk about the focus and some of the key passages. In this case, in the letter to the Colossians, the focus is Christ. And we'll be talking about the focus of Ephesians. They are very close, but this one is more about the Messiah, and Ephesians is more about the church. They both have Christological and ecclesiological, very important things to say. So this letter is quite important for its Christological teaching. And the key passage is in chapter 1, and notice that we'll divide it up, and you'll see this as we read it. The first part is about the lordship of Jesus the Messiah in creation, and the second part is the lordship of Jesus the Messiah in the church. So notice there's ecclesiology happening in this letter. But let's read it together. So you should stop the video, open up to that place, and read it with me. All right, so we're in chapter 1, verse 15. And he, meaning Jesus, is the image of the invisible God, the firstborn of all creation. For, notice this is about his lordship in creation. For by him all things were created, both in the heavens and on earth, visible and invisible, whether thrones or dominions or rulers or authorities, all things have been created by him and for him. And he is before all things, and in him all things hold together. So really important understanding of Jesus, who is also God, being the Lord of creation. Then we move to his lordship in the church. Paul goes immediately from all things holding together in Jesus to he is also the head of the body. Now that's language that Paul uses elsewhere, especially in Ephesians. The church. So he is the head of the body, the church, and he is the beginning, the firstborn from the dead, so that he himself might come to have first place in everything. For it was the Father's good pleasure for all the fullness to dwell in him, in Jesus, and through him to reconcile all things to himself, having made peace through the blood of his cross. Through him, I say, whether things on earth or things in heaven. And this reconciliation and peacemaking has a lot to do with peacemaking between the Gentiles and the Jews, which will show up in Ephesians in more detail. Chapter 1, which we've read a large portion of, is incredibly important theological background, and then Paul builds on it in chapter 2, where we will look at the heresy. And also just to note, words like unity and fullness show up in this letter a lot, just like they do in Ephesians, which is why they're called twin letters. All right, so let's move on then to the Colossian heresy. The best clues for figuring out what the heresy is are in chapter 2, verses 8 through 23, and that's a long section, but I'm going to read the whole thing and then watch. Here are things that we know about the heresy, and there on the next slide there will be things we are guessing about it, but already you can just be watching for things. They fail to give Jesus Christ, the Messiah, the supreme place. They reject the body, which is matter, as evil, and seem to deny that Jesus had come in the flesh. In other words, they are proto-Gnostics. And I'll give you a slide at the very end suggesting where you can go to learn more about Gnosticism. And their teachers are syncretic. That means They are combining teachings from various religious movements together. So these heretics that are infiltrating the church. So let's read 8 through 23. Paul says to the church, "See to it that no one takes you captive through philosophy and empty deception, according to the tradition of men, according to the elementary principles of the world, rather than according to Messiah. For in him, the Messiah, all the fullness," there's that fullness language, "all the fullness of deity dwells in bodily form. And in him," again, this is very Christological, isn't it? "In him, in Jesus, you have been made complete, and he is the head over all rule and authority. And in him, you were also circumcised with a circumcision made without hands," not the Jewish circumcision, "in the removal of the body of the flesh by the circumcision of Christ, having been buried with him in baptism, in which you also were raised up with him through faith in the working of God, who raised him from the dead. And when you were dead in your transgressions and the uncircumcision of your flesh, he made you alive together with him, having forgiven us all our transgressions, having canceled out the certificate of debt consisting of decrees against us, and which was hostile to us, and he has taken it out of the way, having nailed it to the cross." So he's explaining why this heresy has no authority and power over them by saying what Jesus did. "When he had disarmed the rulers and authorities, he made a public display of them, having triumphed over them through him." And now he's going to come back to some aspects of the heresy. "Therefore, let no one act as your judge in regard to food or drink, or in respect to a festival or a new moon or a Sabbath day." That sounds kind of Jewish. We'll come to that on the second slide. "Things which are a mere shadow of what is to come, but the substance belongs to Messiah. Let no one keep defrauding you of your prize by delighting in self-abasement and the worship of the angels, taking his stand on visions that he has seen, inflated without cause by his fleshly mind, and not holding fast to the head." Of course, that's Jesus, right? "From whom the entire body, being supplied and held together by the joints and ligaments, grows with a growth that is from God. If you have died with Christ," and he just said that they had in baptism, right? "If you have died with Christ to the elementary principles of the world, why do you submit yourself to decrees as if you were living in the world? Decrees such as do not handle, do not taste, do not touch, which all refer to things that are destined to perish with the using, in accordance with the commandments and teachings of people." And now the last verse. "These are matters which have, to be sure, the appearance of wisdom in self-made religion and self-abasement and severe treatment of the body, but they are of no value against fleshly indulgence." So there were things that we could see pretty clearly in this passage. We know these things about the heresy, but there are also things that we are guessing are also going on. We see evidence of asceticism, which is like, refraining from pleasure, but also of mystery religion and esoteric teachings. And those are also very Greek things, but we also see some Jewish things, and this is why we're saying syncretism. They are mixing religious systems together. There is evidence of legalism, possibly Jewish mysticism, which would be sort of the counterpoint to the mystery religions among the Gentiles. Maybe the Judaizers have been here. And is that why he mentions circumcision, for example? Well, that's Colossians. And I mentioned Gnosticism and Proto-Gnosticism. And so if you like, you may want to go to those videos to watch them before you go further in this series on Colossians, Philemon, and Ephesians. but there will be 2 more videos on those letters coming up. And and it's on, if you go to YouTube and you search for the Biblical Literacy Project, you'll be able to find those and other videos as well.